Welcome to One Sharp Sword, cutting through to what matters most. I'm your host, Dr. P. Wayne Purnell, the breakthrough success coach and your powerful presence mentor. Today, I have a really special guest. I met this woman in New York City on a trip a few months ago, and we had a conversation that just struck me. Some of you know that my father passed away last March, and it's been an interesting thing to get through and get past and get over and hang on to and all that stuff that goes with it. Felicia Barlow Clar is a sacred life celebrant and funeral disruptor. And when we got to talking, I wanted to know more. She's also an award-winning producer and author. She has really focused. She's niched her company to provide an alternative to funeral homes, and that allows for bereavement in a very, very intentional way. She's an advocate for end-of-life education, and she has podcasts and workbooks, and she does consulting to cover all of this. There's a whole lot more. She's received awards. She's received special education. And I would like to invite Felicia Barlow Clar to tell us more. Thank you for being on One Sharp Sword, Felicia.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I know, like, when we did meet, it was kind of odd, like when you were telling me what you did, that there was a fit, but there is.
Yes. Yeah, right. So I do breakthrough success coaching, and you're like, well, I help people figure out what happens besides the traditional funeral stuff. So It was a great conversation because it allowed me to just explore. Like I explore the world from a space of curiosity. And whenever there's something that's slightly against the norm that we're all used to, I'm drawn to it. I'm like, we are so used to doing things a certain way, like grieving, like going through funeral services in a very particular way. And you're like, well, I do things, or I see things a little differently around that.
Yes.
And you talked about the dash, like, from birth to death, there's this other thing. And so first, what I'd love to do is to talk about what it is, like, what is this unique perspective you have? And then the second thing I'd love to do is to back it up and have you tell us how you got there. So what is this unique perspective on sacred life celebration and how it disrupts kind of the typical funerals and mourning?
Well, I would say it's all kind of connected, like how I got into it and what I do, because my sister and my stepfather passed away about within a year and a half of each other. And when we used the same funeral home, when we went there, we were handed the same templates for both of them. And it was just eye-opening to me as an event planner, event producer, how template that was. Because here was my stepfather, who was 92 years old, had been a trailblazing civil rights person in Washington, D.C., worked in hospitality, with every notable person you could think of at the time. And then there was my sister, who was the mother of four, hysterical, actually not probably, but the funniest person I've ever known, life of the party, all that. And I'm like, and they're handing me the same templates. I'm like, these are not the same people. These, the prayers that they give you, which did not fit, do you want the beach scene? Do you want the outdoor scene? Whatever. Like, the beach perfectly fit my stepfather. None of it fit my sister. So I at least knew the questions to ask, being an event person. Nobody else around the table would know that, and everybody's grieving at the time. So I was able to ask the funeral director, like, well, can we use my sister's poetry on that prayer card instead of that. And she's like, oh, let me think about that. Oh, okay, I don't see why not. So it was even, I think, eye-opening to the funeral director how much you could curtail things just so much that it tells that person's story versus, I almost want to say, like the grief story that we all live in a funeral home. And with my sisters, I put up all the funny pictures of her. Now, some people were like, why'd you put that picture in there? I'm like, because that's who she was. And at the end of her service, I had music playing throughout. I turned the funeral directors into live event producers that day, telling them when to press play and what songs to play through the service. And at the end of it, there was a song that her children wanted, which had absolutely nothing to do with anything other than it was special to them and actually to me too, because we used to joke about it. It was Mr. Boombastic and the Mr. Bean dancing to it, if you've ever seen the movie. And I could just like intuitively feel my sister telling me the day before the service, that's great that you're playing that song, but you all need to get up and dance. So I made a pact with my family that we all got up and danced. And it was such a turn from this sad service at the end to everybody dancing, because those that really understood my sister and got what we were doing all got up and joined us. And you could almost see like the light bulbs going off in their heads as they were like, like this moment of joy, this moment of actually celebrating who she was. So that's what I offer now in my services, is something that is so personal to that person that is the person who passed, whereas most funerals actually focus on grief and the people that are left behind, I find.
So it really is a celebration, and it's very personalized, which is very cool. So do you find that that's pervasive? Like, does every funeral home tend to have these templates? And what's been your experience kind of nationally, or was it that, wow, this one experience in seeing what happened with your sister and what happened with your stepfather, was that right? Yeah, that it's like, okay, here's this funeral home that doesn't get it, I'm going to personalize it. Did you then do research across the country, or you just were like, you know what, here's the possibility, and I'm creating workbooks that anybody can use?
Well, it's kind of twofold. Like, sadly, I've had a lot of loss in my life. So I've been to a lot of funerals at different funeral homes. And I just noticed this pervasive template, rote way that they go about it. I mean, I would say at least here, I'm in the Maryland, DC area. So I'm like, at least here in this area. And I don't think it's anything out of the norm for the rest of the country. And then I did a lot of research during the pandemic because events were shut down. And technically what I do is events. So I did a lot of research and discovered the death positive movement and discovered how many options are out there that nobody, well, not nobody, but I would say the general consuming public has not heard about, because funeral homes don't share them. They don't want you to know that you can do a home funeral. They don't want you to know that, I mean, even green burials, that's a big thing, because not that many places are available yet. So you might have to go somewhere, outside of your region if you really want to do a green funeral. Yeah. But there are so many things. A little bit
about that, because my sister actually had a green funeral, and it's very interesting. So death is not a subject that most people will launch into, and looking at options is not something that most people will do as they're living their day-to-day lives. And so when the time comes that we have to face this for a relative that's passed, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made very fast. So one of the reasons I wanted you here was to talk about, it doesn't have to be urgent. It doesn't have to be pressured. It can actually be relaxed. And the whole idea of a celebration of life is that it's a celebration of life. So can you talk about, like, you have this knowledge
Mhm.
that other people don't have. Can you talk about the death positive movement? You threw that out there like, oh, there's this movement. So
Yeah.
it's not something that most people know about. Can you talk a little bit about, what did you discover and what are the options, and how do you really, like, someone who's got an older parent or an older grandparent, what can they be doing or thinking about now, knowing that, look, someone who's in their 90s is they're going to have an eventuality, right?
Yes.
So it's the one certainty. So talk a little bit about that, the death positive movement. How'd you discover it? And for you, what does that mean? And how did you make that special?
It is a movement that was started, the term was started by a funeral director out in California who has a huge YouTube media presence. She's a little quirky, almost like a Wednesday Addams type, and she does a lot of eye-opening videos about death. Caitlin Dowdy is her name, and she's written a lot of books. And she was the one that coined the phrase when she saw something on Twitter years ago about the sex positive movement. And she was like, well, if we're able to talk about sex, why are we not able to talk about death? And so she coined this phrase, the death positive movement. So that's where that comes from. And it is one of those things, like the way I discovered so much about it was one thing just led to another. I mean, I literally went down a rabbit hole last year discovering, there's open funeral pyre in Colorado, for people like the Indians and the Hindus. That might be something they want to do here in the United States. Or, like I said, the green burials are now one of the big things that's just kind of come out in the last few months is the basically composting your body. They do that. I believe it's in Washington State, and there's another state that's trying to get that done too. But it's just like one thing leads to another of how much there is out there. And there are people that work in the end of life industry that are trying to get this message out. But the thing that I noticed about them is they're talking to each other. You've got all these people within the field talking to each other, and nobody seems, so willing to go out and really talk to the general media or do things like this, podcasts. So that's kind of where I stepped in. I'm like, death is not a bad thing. It's a natural part of life. And the United States is the only one that predominantly has this sort of scary relationship, calls it morbid, versus like I look at it and I'm like, it's not morbid, it's sacred. It's a sacred part of life. It's no different than birth. It's just the opposite end of it. So
that's great.
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask you, like, what are kind of the foundational statements you'd make about what you do? And death is a normal part of life. It's not morbid, it's sacred. And I love both of those, that if we say, how do we approach it, right? How do we approach death? That it's a normal part of life. It's part of what happens. We don't know for sure what happens after, but we do know that the body wears out, right? Yeah. And it's predictable for the most part.
Yes.
So,
yes.
For the most part. There are accidents, certainly there's disease and, all those things that are sudden, but mostly it's predictable and it's a normal part of life. Mm-hmm. How do we get the conversation going? What kinds of conversations should we have? You were saying that folks in the death and dying business seem to be talking to themselves in that industry. How do we create a conversation, just like a dinner time conversation? Is it something we talk about over the dinner table?
I would say I do. And ironically enough, my younger sister is a former funeral director. So, I'd have to say she's the one that really started the conversation in our family. It was one side of the family and talking about death and kind of normalizing it within our family. And then just having so many experiences of it, it does become a part of the conversation. And sadly, my sister, she didn't pass away unexpectedly, but she passed away suddenly. And so that is the thing that really shifted my thinking, because I tried, for 25 years to save her, and she was an alcoholic. So after she passed away, it was just a complete shift in me. And I hate to say, it was almost like having a burden lifted off my shoulders. I mean, it sounds kind of callous, but I knew she was where she wanted to be. She had told me since she was a teenager that she was not going to live past a certain age. So she didn't want help. So that really shifted my perception about death too, is, just having that experience of somebody that did not want to be here anymore. And, I have my whole feelings about suicide as well, because that's really what alcoholism is in the way she did, is slow suicide. It's horrible to watch. But then, on the other side of it, it just bonded my family in a different way. And we were able to talk about, more. I mean, we're kind of going into the mental health conversation here, which is a whole other animal to tackle.
It is.
Yeah. I wrote my workbooks after discovering all of this stuff in the death positive movement. So a lot of the information is compiled into 2 books so that people can sit down and not have to go down the rabbit hole like I did, and can see a lot of the things that are out there. And that does help start the conversation, because planning is so important. And that is the one thing I would say everybody in the end of life industries emphasizes and is trying to really get that message out, is plan. We plan everything else. We've got insurance for everything else. And we tend to just leave the details of our death and our funeral or celebration of life up to somebody else. It becomes a part of, I don't need to handle that. And really, we should.
So Felicia, talk a little bit about, if we're not even thinking about that as part of our routine, and we're planning our next vacation, we might be planning our trust. We might be planning, financial security. We might be planning for the next big purchase we have. How do we plan for, what are some of the steps when you talk about planning? What should we know? What should we be thinking about? Planning for end of life as a natural progression of life. How do we plan for that? Walk us through some of the initial thoughts or questions that we should be asking ourselves.
The first thing I think is important is to have a will or a trust, the legal paperwork. I prefer the revocable trust versus a will. A will is a part of a revocable trust, but that helps simplify so many things, like when it comes to probate and taxes and who's getting what, as far as beneficiaries. My husband and I set one up long before I ever even got into this, because it just seemed to be the simpler way to tackle this. And people have a real myth thinking when they think that they have to have tons of assets and be wealthy in order to have a trust. That's not true. I mean, you do have to have certain assets to fund it, but anybody can have a revocable trust. So I would start there with the legal aspect of it, the will. And then
let me pause for a second. Okay. My experience after my father passed was, how the movies are, the lawyer gathers all the family around and reads and then says, and you get this, and you get this, and you get this, and everybody leaves and they're all either happy or unhappy or whatever, knowing they've got this. It doesn't work that way at all. It's, there has to be an accounting, there has to be certain taxes that are set aside, there has to be all this stuff. And the good news about a trust is that the trust actually provides for that to happen, and it identifies who gets what as part of it. Yeah. And it takes a while. it takes a while. It's not like gather round, he's left you this. It's not that at all. And so just to know that a trust does help incredibly. Without a trust, you are going through probate. There's state stuff that you need to do, and that could take up to 3 years, if not more. So having a document that is a living trust or revocable trust, that's a very good first step.
Yeah. I have available on my website a free downloadable executor checklist, because there is so much to think about that people are not aware of. And you have to think of things from, if you are a veteran, from a military funeral, to if you own a pet, to the taxes, closing out the estate, everything. And that's all in this checklist I have, because it's so thorough. And my brother stood as executor for my sisters, and my mother, of course, has been executor for my stepfather. So we all sat down and reviewed it. So thought of absolutely everything we could think of to put on this executor checklist. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Why don't you just say what website it is now, and we'll talk about it again at the end?
Oh, okay. It's celebratingthedash.com, because that's what I'm all about, which, people look at me like, oh, you're the lady that focuses on grief and death. I'm like, no, I'm actually the lady that focuses on life and living, living life to its fullest versus, kind of being in our head and, go bungee jump if you want to bungee jump.
Right. So celebrating the dash, mm-hmm. That is the dash between born and death date, right? Born on and died on.
Your living years.
Is the hyphen, right? The dash.
Yep.
Celebratingthedash.com. Easy enough to remember. And the executor checklist. All right. So I interrupted you on purpose when you were talking about the trust as being one of the first things. What are a few of the next things that people should be thinking about and or taking action on?
They should actually think of how they want to dispose of their body. It seems like this simple thing, like, well, I'll just call the funeral home and we'll be buried. I'm like, no, there's cremation. Now we know there's compost. There's turning yourself into stones. That's something that's fairly new as well. There's the open funeral pyre. Then there's the home funeral, which that requires so much planning. And for people that, think that all funerals are very expensive too, and on average in the United States, they are about $10,000, I'd say, if you use a traditional funeral home, but they don't have to be. I'd say one of the smartest things I learned from interviewing the executive director of the Funeral Consumers Alliance is that people should budget first. Don't just go into a funeral home and let them dictate it. Go in and say, this is how much I have to spend, because then they can work with you on, okay, well, we could cremate and have something simple. You could do something in a park. Like I said, there's so many options out there, but people tend to think they must use a funeral home. And I think it's every state you don't have to use a funeral home. There's 9 states that you do have to use a funeral director. So like I said, there's so much out there that I could be sitting here for hours talking about.
And one of the things you didn't mention was disposing of the body. You could donate it.
Yes, that's in my book too.
Right? Yep. It could go to science.
Yes.
There are schools that need cadavers. Yes. There are hospitals that need organs. And it's not hospitals, it's the people in the hospitals that need organs. And so that's all part of it before the body is either refrigerated and then entombed, or before the body is embalmed, right? It's like, mm-hmm. And the body is the body, right? So that's the other thing is perspective, right? You have to have a perspective that your body isn't really that useful after the living part of it is gone.
Right. So, and isn't that kind of sad, because it really can be to other people, like donating organs,
Exactly.
It can be very useful.
Very.
That was one of the things I discovered too when I did all this research, and I didn't know, is that when you donate your body to science, a lot of times after they are done with what they need it for, they will cremate it and send you the remains back. So you can still do a celebration of life later on.
It's about a year. That's I learned that actually from my daughter has gone through human physiology, right? So and in her studies, she got to participate in a cadaver lab and recognized that bodies come and then they are useful for students, and then they are with dignity, they are packed back up and they're sent off, and then they are returned. And it takes about a year. And it's a very interesting process. And again, nobody really, like, I won't say nobody, but certainly this isn't a common discussion.
No.
Right? And
Nope.
so the purpose of having you here is to make it a much more common discussion. I was in a class in undergrad many decades ago, and I did I forget, it was a religious studies class, and I did a segment on death and dying. And I interviewed funeral directors, and I will tell you that in going through a funeral home for the first time, and I'm like this 18-year-old kid, and this funeral director was absolutely fine with me taking a tour. And he walks me into the parlor, and there's an open casket, and I freaked out because there's a person in there. And it's like, but the person's very basically laid to rest, right? And it's like it's in a dignified way, and it's one of those, you come in contact with death and realize it is a thing. It just is a thing. And it's just interesting because we all approach it differently. It was, the first time for me was a shock. And then after that, it's like, no, that's the realization. It is a thing, and it needs to be a part of a conversation. And not everybody needs to see their relative's body. That doesn't have to be a thing, right? Other people want to. And so really between celebrating the dash, I think, is a big deal. How do you choose to celebrate end of life? How do you choose to celebrate life at the end of life? And that's your work, which I think is fabulous. So what have been some of the more fun things that people can think about? Nobody thinks of death as fun. You're all about celebrating the dash, which is, how do we really bring a life celebration to what, at least in the United States, we have this kind of assumption that funerals are sad, right? So how do we bring this celebration so that mourning is accepted, and that's not necessarily the focus, right? The grief is real, the loss is real, and at the same time, there's a lot to celebrate from the person that's been with us. So how do you manage that, and how do you I'll just let you answer that. It's wide open.
I think for me, because I have experienced so much life from so much loss from an early age, that I realized at a certain point that, people think they need to get over grief or get through grief. And I'm like, grief becomes a part of who you are. It's how you handle it, Like for me, I could be perfectly fine one moment and hear a song on the radio that reminds me of my sister and my stepfather, and I break out crying. And that's just the reality of grief. It is always going to be a part of who you are. It's how you manage it, for one, or accept it. So that's why I chose to look at celebrations of life, in funerals, and focus on the person, because I absolutely think every person is here for a reason. And like your relationship with the person and how that person affected you could be completely different from, your spouse or the child or whatever. And so it's focusing on who that person was to everybody, what that special element was about them that I would say changes us. And that is that part that then becomes part of the grief process is, they're always somewhere in you, in your heart, in your mind. So that's what I chose to focus on is the person's life, their legacy.
It's so great.
Yeah.
I'm going to repeat back some of the things you said because sometimes that just gets lost in a conversation, right? Managing loss. So bullet point, grief becomes a part of who you are. It's not about getting past it. It's not about getting over it. It's not about getting through it. It's about allowing it, right? And not wallowing in it either. It's not like there are some people that take it on and that becomes the entirety of who they are.
Yeah.
It becomes a part of who you are. And grief storms are a thing. I learned about that when my mom passed. When my mom passed, about 2 weeks after she passed away, I was picking out clothes for the morning, and it was a normal morning, and I was getting ready for work, and all of a sudden, in looking at a shirt, the shirt didn't trigger anything. It was just this sudden thing that was like a flood, right? And it was, wow, it came over. And when I learned the term grief storm, it was like, this makes so much sense. It's like this dark cloud flies over, rains, and flies off. And that's the way it felt. It was like, I'm having a normal day. Whew, now it's not. Whew, now it's sunshine again. That's normal. And eventually the grief goes or transforms, right? Because I still have a place in my heart for my mom. I have a place in my heart for my dad, a place in my heart for my sister. Like there's been loss in my life. And you get through it by holding a special place for them, which leads to bullet point number 2, which is focus on the person and their purpose for being here. And part 2 of that bullet point is, and the part of them that changes us. And that was profound because each of us is changed by someone in our lives, and we're changed differently. We are affected by them differently. So that's why I take notes when I have interviews. This is great. Yeah. Stuff gets lost, right? So yeah.
I'd never heard the term grief storm, but yeah, that kind of explains what I said. Like when I'm perfectly fine and then I hear a song on the radio and I just bawl my eyes out.
Yeah.
I want to read something that I read the other day because I find it so profound about grief, because I do think the sad thing, and I'm going to say again, like, I think it's a very American way that we handle things, is that we carry grief around like luggage, and it's not healthy. And so I read this the other day and I said, it's so beautiful. And it says, you got to resurrect the deep
Who's
pain.
this from first?
Oh gosh, I will try to pronounce her name. It was a tweet. Aya Ihima. Her Twitter handle is at Ihai Miora. It looks like an African name.
Okay.
But it says, you got to resurrect the deep pain within you and give it a place to live that's not within your body. Let it live in art. Let it live in writing. Let it live in music. Let it be devoured by building brighter connections. Your body is not a coffin for pain to be buried in. Put it somewhere else. And that like when I read that, I was like, that is exactly part of my message too, is grief is so unhealthy to just carry around. And I mean, I read some sad things on social media of people just holding on to the pain.
Right. Yeah. Don't let the pain, like grief doesn't have to be painful. That's the other piece. And that's huge, is that grief is it doesn't have to be painful. And I'm going to just make that note so I don't forget it, because I want to make sure that's in my show notes.
Mhm.
And this is a thing, is that a lot of times it's almost like, there are stages that we go through. And right, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in the late 60s identified the stages of grief and loss, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Denial is like, I'm just going to call so and so. Oh, they're not here. Like, and then anger is, why did they have to be that way? Why did she have to drink? Why did, and it could be anger at God. Why'd you take this person so soon? It could be anger itself. If only I had done something differently, which leads to bargaining, which is if only. And if you find yourself in this if only space of, if only they had done something different, if only the doctors had caught it sooner, if only she didn't go out on that drive that evening, if only I had caught the symptoms sooner, if only, that's the bargaining. And so denial, anger, bargaining, depression puts you in the space of just feeling deeply, deeply sad and not able to move. And, nothing, things don't process the same. And that can take a couple hours to a couple days to a couple weeks to a couple months. And that's individual for everybody. And then there's this acceptance, and the acceptance is not, and everything's great now, they're gone. It's like, it's not jolly acceptance. It's an acceptance of the reality that this person is no longer in your life. Right. There's still times, my dad passed in March. There's still times that it's like, oh, I've got this joke that I would have, and it starts to be that I'd love to tell him. And then it's that I would have loved to have told him. Right. He was somebody who enjoyed humor and bad dad jokes and that kind of stuff. And it's just like that. The acceptance of, I would have loved to have been able to share that with him. And I wonder who else I can share it with, because, right, that's my humor too. So I love the idea that grief doesn't have to be painful, that it is a process, that it doesn't belong living in your body, and that expressing it is huge. And that's actually one of the first times I've heard that is, that grief doesn't have to live in your body.
Yeah.
Right. Love that. Love that. What else are you hoping to share, or should, do you think that we were going to talk about, we need to talk about? What else is brewing?
First of all, I want to say about that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the interesting thing about that is that study was actually done on the dying patients. So all of those stages of grief actually were about the people that were dying, not those left behind. And it's gotten like transferred that it's about the people left behind. And I find that so interesting that it really does mirror. Like I come to that, it mirrors.
Yeah, because that's absolutely accurate. And it mirrors those left behind. And the studies that came from it actually go into anticipatory grief, where when you hear the news that somebody is ill, and it could be 5 years down the road, there's a person that has a disease and it could take a long time. The anticipatory grief, the stages are identical. Right? And it's like, well, this diagnosis can't be true. Right? And it's very interesting. And I love that. It's absolutely right. The original studies were around those basically diagnosed and in a space of the death and dying process, and that it does transfer to those losing, because think about this. When you've lost your car keys and you are running around frantically, it is like, they were right here. Like, it's the exact same process. The denial, I had them. Where are they? Right. And then the anger of, all right, who took them? Who took them? Like, did the dog do it? Did that, right? And then it's bargaining. All right, if only I had a place for him, if I could hang him every single time, if only. And then the depression, like, well, now I'm going to be late. Now everything's going to be terrible because this one event has happened. And then it's like, all right, if I've lost my keys, there have to be different, like, there's somewhere else I need to be doing other things. I need to be making calls to let people on my schedule know I'm going to be late. I need to do this. And you accept that this thing that you had is no longer there. It is identical. Now, the other part of this is that, and this is where the studies take us to, is that it is cyclical. So it's not always linear. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. We're going to just get through it. It's like denial, anger, bargaining, anger, bargaining, depression. Bargaining, depression. It's like that. That is a thing as well. So, I love that. I love that you brought it up, that it was originally done on studies on those in the process of death and dying. Mm-hmm. And it does transfer, and it does relate to any kind of loss, right?
Yeah.
So cool.
I think one of the things I wanted to touch on was, you brought it up earlier about how it's so ingrained in us that it's an urgent process, and the only time it really needs to be done within the 7 to 10 days is if there is a body being buried. Otherwise, there is no urgency that has to be done. I mean, other than a home funeral as well, if you want to have the body laid out. That and it's becoming more widely known, but it's still worth saying, is that 9 times out of 10, you do not need to embalm a body. That's just an extra expense. And that's a purely American thing I learned from my sister. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's myths out there.
I love myth busting. Like that kind of stuff is huge, that you don't have to embalm a body, and it's bad for the earth. You know, it's like, it's not like the body is going to be on display somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, dig up this body of this person that you knew, and in 20 years, it's like, no.
Right. You only need it if you are going to have an extended viewing time. And even then, like, my sister said something to me in my podcast I did with her about what you said when you approached that first body you saw in the casket. Like, oh, they're so, and I want to say dead. And she's like,
exactly, right?
Dead. We don't want them to look dead, so we embalm them. I'm like, yeah. It did have a scientific basis behind it back in the Civil War, so that's where it started. But now, like, now we don't need it.
Yes. So what else are there parting comments that you would love our viewing and listening audience to really take away? These are just understand this.
I just want people to know that however they are in life, they can be remembered in death. And there are so many resources out there that they, can look towards. Like I said, there's some listed on my website. Just things like knowing that you can go up in fireworks if you want. Your body, your cremains can go up in fireworks. They can be buried in this beautiful underwater tomb off of Florida. They can go up in space. I'm like, there's so much out there that we do not have to be limited to what funeral homes kind of dictate to us as the only way for us to grieve. We all have a different spiritual basis, religious beliefs, everything. And I think that we should honor them in our own way, So
I think that's awesome. I'd never heard about the fireworks as a possibility. And I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
Boom.
I know. Once you realize all the choices, then you start going, oh gosh, how do I want to be remembered? And that's the thing I want people to do, is pre-plan. Like I said, I've got workbooks available that help with that pre-plan. Because when it does come down to it, when you just leave it up to loved ones to do it, an executor or a family member, they're going to be grieving. So that's why you get these rote kind of celebration or funerals, really. because who is in that mindset to be planning something so thorough? Like I said, I'm an event planner. That's my background. And that was the thing that the kind of the gift I brought to my sister's funeral was I have that thinking capability of being an event planner. The rest of my family did not. They were in the grief. They did help make selections and everything, but just like I said, the questions to ask. So plan. That's
awesome.
Yeah.
Right. So plan.
Yeah.
One of the things I talk about is, you're not the same person you were 20 years ago. You are at a point in your life where pretty much 100% of us are in some form of personal transition, personal, professional, financial, spiritual relationship. There's some kind of transition, and we plan our vacations in more detail than we plan who we want to become in the next couple of years. Mm-hmm. Well, I think also on top of that is not only who do you want to become and can you plan to live into that, but also who do you want to be remembered for? Who do you want to be remembered as? And plan that so that the people that are around you understand that. One of the things I talk about in leadership is understand your values and have clarity. And it's one thing for you to have clarity, but it's another thing then to communicate those values. And this translates perfectly to this subject of kind of end of life celebrations. So Felicia Barlow Clar, thank you for being with me. Really, really appreciate it. Mm-hmm. I will say the name of your website, or if you would like to say the name of your website one more time.
It is celebratingthedash.com.
Celebratingthedash.com. All right. Lots of workbooks, lots of great information there. Felicia, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah. Very interesting conversation.
Very. Yeah. This is a one sharp sword cutting through to what matters most. I've had with me Felicia Barlow Clar, and I am Dr. P, Dr. Wayne Purnell, your breakthrough success coach. We'll see you here next time.